The School-Non-School Dichotomy by Christopher L. McGunnigle. This is published May 13th this year, 2023. The past couple of semesters I have been struggling with student awareness of audience. There is a profound aversion to adapting writing content to specific audiences, and considering this difficulty that students have with audience awareness, I have speculated that it is mostly the fault of the discourse. Students have difficulty writing for a specific audience because there is no specific audience even when simulated. I don't want to rehash content from previous posts and instead move forward with the idea problem of the composition classroom having no real audience or rhetorical situation. The rhetorical situation is meant for live performances, mainly speech, not writing. There are, however, a variety and multitude of compositional situations which students are continuously performing in within their non-academic contexts. These non-academic contexts, however, cannot easily be adapted to the rhetorical situation of the composition classroom. The example that comes quickest to mind is social media. I've tried in the past to imitate the dynamics of social media within my composition classrooms and found such exercises always failing because they lack some quintessence of the original situation. The socialization of the classroom is simply completely different than that found in non-academic use of social media. A contrast and conflict thus arises between writing which takes place in the classroom and writing in non-academic situations. Non-academic writing is always glorified as free, creative, and authentic, while academic writing robs the student of their own voice with pointless rules and formulas. Any type of writing that is adopted to the classroom context, no matter how relevant to outside non-academic situation, ultimately becomes polluted by the academic reformatting of the situation. As a semi-related example, I'm taking lessons in Japanese, and no matter how much I want to learn Japanese, the fact that I'm doing it as a class makes it a form of work rather than play. What would the experience be like if I learned Japanese outside of the classroom, for example by actually going to Japan? I've seen multiple students, including myself, who have described the experience of trying to apply their language, learning lessons to real-life situations as one of ultimate failure. When the time came for them to ultimately speak in real life, it just didn't happen. As such, there is a lack of transferability from the classroom to real life and the classroom. What then is the purpose of the composition classroom? How does it connect to non-academic situations, and how is it different? How does the essay help our students accomplish writing tasks in other aspects of their lives? Can we teach writing outside of the specific contexts that call for writing? I wrote this post because I have been experimenting with spatial rhetoric and composition, which involves having students go out of the classroom and interact with the environment around them. I am hoping to give them an experience which they can write about, which can also serve as a type of simulated rhetorical situation. While the activities themselves have been overall successful or at least enjoyable to the students, I am not quite sure whether I have achieved a true sense of rhetorical situation yet. What genres are we supposed to be working with for composing in that would glue together the academic and non-academic worlds? A foreword to the publication of Mark Fisher's unfinished Acid Communism, written by Matt Colquhoun. Like so many of his neologisms, Mark Fisher's Acid Communism encapsulates a crisis of disambiguation, hurling a provocation into our midst. The phrase, which was to be the title of his next book, now unfinished following his death in January 2017, has garnered considerable attention as many wonder what kind of variation on Marx's manifesto might be occasioned by this new corrosive qualifier. In truth, acid communism resists definition. The word acid in particular, by invoking industrial chemicals, psychedelics, and various subgenres of dance music, is promiscuous. With so many uses and instantiations in various contexts, it is as difficult to cleanly define as communism is in the 21st century. This textual promiscuity is no doubt what attracted Fisher to the phrase, but this has not stopped recent attempts to concretely define it in his absence. Jeremy Gilbert, a former collaborator of Fisher's, has led the way, writing a number of articles that turn acid communism into a one-dimensional and purely affirmative project. Seeking the rehabilitation of the countercultural utopianism of the 1960s and 70s, In The New Statesman, Gilbert writes on acid in particular and the way that the word still connotes the liberation of human consciousness from the norms of capitalist society as a desirable, achievable, and a pleasurable objective. Gilbert 2017. What is absent from Gilbert's summaries is made clear here. Is such a liberation of human consciousness desirable? Certainly. Achievable? Possibly. But pleasurable? Not always, not essentially. Acid communism is a project beyond the pleasure principle. It is not only a project for the recuperation of the counterculture's lost potentials, but also the expression of a desire for an experimental, rather than prescriptively utopian, leftist politics. This is a maneuver present within so many expositions of communism. Marx and Engels themselves wrote how communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. Marx and Engels 2017, 102. Acid communism is, then, a project for seeking the outside of socio-political hegemony. As Fischer acknowledged in so many of his writings, this requires an acknowledgement of the fact that disturbed normality is inherently disturbing, but terrors are not all there is to the outside. Fischer 2016, 9. In the unpublished introduction to Acid Communism, Fischer quotes Michel Foucault explaining that the challenge now is not to recover our lost identity, to free our imprisoned nature, our deepest truth, but instead to move towards something radically other. Foucault 1991, 120. This other is the spectre that Marx and Engels first conjured out of European history. For Herbert Marcuse, it was the spectre of a world that could be free. Marcuse 1998, 93. What haunted Fischer was a similar notion, a collective subject that has long been desired but still resists instantiation. As he wrote in his 2009 book Capitalist Realism, the required subject, a collective subject, does not exist, yet the crisis, like all the other global crises we're now facing, demands that it be constructed. Here, a spectre is not what is left of something dead and lost. It is atemporal, an eerie entity, as Fischer would say, representing both a failure of absence and a failure of presence. It is desire without absolute lack. For Marx, desire is so often inseparable from the commodity. It is never without object. On the very first page of Capital, quoting Nicholas Barbon, Marx defines it as in a footnote. Desire implicates want, it is the appetite of the mind, and as natural as hunger to the body. In the Communist Manifesto, however, desire becomes insatiable and speculative. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. The production of politics has had much the same effect, eroticizing desire, launching it into unknown and forbidden lands, beyond borders, boundaries, and limits. Pleasure becomes, in contrast, fatally associated with the familiar. Acid, in its promiscuity, allows the speculative desire to flow back through communism in both new and forgotten ways. Writing in 1977, Gilles Deleuze offers the most succinct summary of how such a desire functions, explicitly in contrast to Foucauldian pleasure. There is no subject of desire, and no object either. The objectivity of desire itself is only its flows. There is never enough desire. Desire is the system of signifying signs, out of which unconscious flows are produced in a social historical field. Every unfolding of desire, in whatever place it may occur, such as a family or a school in the neighborhood, tests the established order and sends shockwaves through the social field as a whole. Desire is revolutionary because it is always seeking more connections. In this way, acid is desire, as corrosive and denaturalizing multiplicity, flowing through the multiplicities of communism itself to create alinguistic feedback loops, an ideological accelerator through which the new and previously unknown might be found in the politics we mistakenly think we already know, reinstantiating a politics to come. Now, one of Colquhoun's blog posts on xenogothic.com from May 12, 2019, 0 Books and Acid Communism. I was informed this morning by a lovely Facebook follower that my essay on acid communism written for Crisis Journal last year gets a shout out in the latest 0 Books video, Acid Communism, Philip K. Dick, and the New Culture. This was a surprise, not least because my conversation with this person had been about how little I personally got out of the previous Zero video on acid communism. It seems the disinterest is somewhat reciprocated, though. Mr. Douglas Lane does not seem to agree with my conclusions. To quote Lane's citation in full, in an article for the journal Crisis, a writer named Colquhoun wrote that acid communism is a project for seeking the outside of socio-political hegemony, and that such a questing after an exit from this society is likely to disrupt normal life in ways that Fisher thought would be inherently disturbing, but Fisher also argued that such terrors are not all there is to the outside. I would argue that there is no outside to this current global society. That is, even if we take heroic doses of psychedelics, we'll still trip and hallucinate within the logic of the present. I've said this before, but I think this applies very well to this notion of acid communism. Our goal should not be to wake up from the nightmare we're in, but to dream differently. And, quote, I've written so much about acid communism here that I'm reluctant to repeat myself, but I think this question of there being no outside is a common misunderstanding of what is at stake in Marx's late thought. After all, Fisher himself said that the inside is a folding of the outside, and it's the sort of understanding that goes back to the German idealists, rendered anew in the pulp world of weird fiction. The absence of this from Lane's understanding feels like the result of his particular obsession of Hegel, a dash of Schelling, a bit more Marx, and a dollop of Spinoza, and Lane might find that the objections he's making are already preempted in Fisher's own writings, and long before the acid communism project even properly started to take shape. On this issue of the outside, I'd point to this old post of mine, Notes on the Communist Horizon as an Imminent Outside. Regarding Fisher's own writings, I'd point towards two key proto-acid communist posts that appeared on the K-Punk blog back in 2004, Psychedelic Reason and Psychedelic Fascism. Taken together, they completely undermine Lane's fixation on psychedelics, another Jeremy Gilbert hangover that wasn't Mark's bag. The trap that Lane has fallen into and run away with for 2 long YouTube videos, Eek, echoes Gilbert's own micro-fascist reduction of the acid communism agenda in not knowing where Gilbert ends and Mark Fisher begins, which Gilbert doesn't seem to know either. The point about micro-fascism is an important one. It's something which feels pretty common at the moment in our various circles. Gilbert and Zero books are only perpetuating the kind of thought I think Mark was trying to resist. For example, in his video, Lane tells a rambling stoner story about being high as a kite in a friend's car and explaining that politics should be about giving people the power to rearrange their realities. Sounds like Fisher's overarching political project, huh? Whilst Lane acknowledges this, it is apparently the sort of idea that people are only capable of believing in if they're sufficiently stoned. It's a twisted argument which ends up unwittingly using Fisher to poke holes in himself, conflating his arguments around the constitution of psychedelic reason and psychedelic fascism into a flat blob, and this is based on little more than Lane's own anecdote of having a Fisherian thought while stoned. It ends up echoing the sort of critique of experimental music, the music for and or made by people on drugs, delegitimizing the creativity and aesthetic explorations of another based on nothing more than your own woefully cloistered imagination. Further to this, Lane's reading of PKD is very bizarre and also tellingly selective. I'd point again to another K-Punk post, Ubique as Petit Object A, which offers a reading of Dick's work in relation to fictioning as consciousness-raising, which seems wholly contrary to Lane's own. As readers of this blog may already be aware, it's my opinion that the weird and the eerie is integral to any understanding of Marx's acid communism project. I've written on this in an exploratory way here and here. We can also look to the lectures he gave before his death, and the lectures anticipated going forwards, to get a sense of what acid communism the book was going to contain. Whilst I've heard of various plans for different chapters that aren't represented here, it does seem to be very close to the general trajectory that the book itself would take. All this stuff is readily accessible and available online. It's the sort of thing we can start exploring easily with nothing more than a Google search. It's that fact that makes Gilbert's readings of acid communism so frustrating to me. They're so easily refutable, but no one seems bothered about seeing what Mark himself had to say. We deserve, and Mark deserves, far better engagement than that offered by Jeremy Gilbert's ego, and Zero books in extending that line really isn't helping. A Simon Sellars interview with John Foxx, published on July 11th, 2006. John Foxx, the former lead singer of Ultravox, is an undisputed electronic music pioneer. Before Midge Ure came along, the band's three Foxx-driven albums, Ultravox 1977, Ha 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 1978, and Systems of Romance 1978, fused near-future melancholy with icy man-machine interfaces and the remake/remodel aesthetic of Eno-era Roxy music, portraying a demonstrable Ballardian outlook, all crumbling cities, random genders, and the music that machines make. Foxx left Ultravox after Systems of Romance, tired of the group mentality. In 1980 he was back with his first solo album, Metamatic, which birthed the all-synthetic metal beat sound. As Foxx says, he was reading way too much J.G. Ballard when he made this album, and it's obvious. JGB is etched into every groove, from the car crash scenarios in the lyrics to the glimpses of shattered glass, plazas, underpasses, and urban sites of psychological degradation. If you know a bit about Ballard, you've probably heard of Metamatic, even if Foxx's work is less familiar. It's the one that always gets name-checked as the archetypal Ballardian album. A few more well-regarded albums later, and Foxx disappeared from the music scene for around 10 years. Using his real name, Dennis Lee, he worked as a visual artist, designing book covers for the likes of Salman Rushdie and Jeanette Winterson. In the 1990s, he again made music, mainly in collaboration with Lewis Gordon, with a thoroughly modern update of the Metamatic sound. He also found time to release 3 CDs of his Cathedral Oceans concept, architectural ambient music, that seeks to tease out the latent psychogeography and spirituality of urban ruins. As you find out in this interview, Cathedral Oceans, too, is not a million miles from Ballard. The continuum is also found in Foxx's latest album, Tiny Color Movies, featuring the imaginary soundtracks Foxx composed after viewing the found film collection of Arnold Weiss Bryant. As Foxx writes in the liner notes, Arnold Weiss Bryant has a huge collection of movies from many sources and in many different media. He stipulates that the movies he collects must be short. None is more than 7 or 8 minutes long, and some have a duration of only a few seconds. He insists that these represent a new kind of art, the movie made outside commercial considerations for the sheer pleasure of film. This category can include found film, the home movie, the repurposed movie fragment. Foxx's channeling and championing of Arnold's media interruptus aesthetic would do Talbot/Travers/Travers in the Atrocity exhibition proud. I spoke to him about the continuing influence of J.G. Ballard in his work. I was in retreat from bands, mightily convinced that electronics were the future, and reading too much J.G. Ballard. I lived alone in Finsbury Park, spent my spare time walking the disused train lines, cycled to the studio every day, and wobbled back at dawn, imagining I was the Marcel Duchamp of electropop. Metamatic was the result. It was the first British electronic pop album. It was minimal, primitive techno-punk, car crash music tailored by Burtons. This is what John Foxx had to say on the Assembly sleeve notes in 1992. Sellers asks, during the Metamatic era, which Ballard books were you reading and how exactly did Ballard's writing influence you? Foxx, I was reading Crash and High Rise and Burroughs, The Wild Boys. These are all making a sort of continuous landscape I recognized, which intersected perfectly with living in London in the mid to late 70s. Grey, grainy, exhausted, yet a constant tantalizing feeling of some kind of event or entity always about to manifest itself. A whirlpool with seductive furniture. That's why you stay. You get edges of the same kind of involvement with the place as I understand hostages can develop for their captors. The car crash scenarios were particularly resonant for me for 3 reasons. First, a perfect metaphor for my own life and what was happening with technology, an enjoyable journey interrupted by a couple of crashes. Second, I love and fear cars, how they've changed cities, landscapes, economies, our apprehension of time and our view of our own bodies, and the way they have made new and terrible crimes possible. 3, because I'd been involved in 2 car crashes and so had some good friends. The beautiful Hyang Ki, who played Synth on the TV performance of No One Driving, was, by complete coincidence, just emerging from surgery to remedy severe facial damage caused by a windscreen in a crash. The TV appearance helped her regain some confidence. The Burton's bit was to ensure the landscape was British, not confusable with America, which I love but I'm always trying to eliminate from some aspects of my work. The geometry of the plaza exercised a unique fascination upon Talbot's mind. J.G. Ballard, The Atrocity Exhibition, 1970. Across the plaza, a giant hoarding of Italian cars. Across the plaza, the lounge is occupied by seminars. Down escalators, come to the sea view. Behind all the smoked glass, no one sees you. A familiar face comes to meet you. I remember your face from some shattered windscreen. From the plaza, the highways curve in over reservoirs. On the plaza, a queue is forming for the cinema. John Foxx, Plaza from Metamatic, 1979. How do you think your relationship to Ballard's writing has changed over the years? In 2006, would you still count him as an influence? Of course, it alters over time, just as memory does. I think he's now part of the beginning of a collective understanding of aspects of the ways technology can affect us and how human desires intertwine with all that, so I feel many of his ideas can only continue to gather resonance. From the late 70s to the early 80s, it seemed that most post-punk artists were happy to claim Ballard as an influence. Newman, Susie, Ian Curtis, Cabaret Voltaire, yourself. Why did Ballard have resonance for such a particular group of musicians back then? I think some of this may have been an attraction to the new modes of physical and intellectual violence on offer, and to the uncompromising outer edge stance. This attraction naturally alters as the mode of the music changes. Many other writers have since begun to colonize what JGB established and elaborated that grammar to deal with new technological events, but it's still essentially the same stance. He was the first radical and relevant novelist of this technological age in Britain. You had Burroughs and Philip K. Dick in America, but they were connected to the beat movement, using drugs as a lens, reflecting an American landscape. I always enjoyed JGB's Englishness, living in a middle-class suburb, writing about a new landscape we'd only just come to live in. More akin to McLuhan's academic/romantic take on the unrecognized present. I think what Ballard maps out so well is that moment of surrender to the terrible, the total, inevitable, final embrace. After Hiroshima, we really had no choice. It was impossible to pretend the world would ever be the same again. We all sleep there every night, now. Ballard blueprinted all that like no one else I've ever read. As far as musical subcultures go, why doesn't Ballard get name-checked today? Ballard has much more competition for attention now. A flood of engaging contemporary writers. There is also the moment of contemporary recognition, where a generation recognizes and comes to trust an author. After a while, the writer becomes part of that generational landscape, and succeeding generations need to find their own. It takes a while for the contemporaneity to fall away. So a writer's relevance can be more accurately assessed. It's too early to view Ballard like that yet. Sometimes it's enough to be relevant to that generation only. As a marginal digression, I have a theory that we can't truly understand anything without a direct sensual involvement. Sensuality is an intellectual device which allows understanding, and I include eroticism with all that. So we have this terrible need to become entangled in order to comprehend. I suppose another part of this compound is a wild and often forlorn hope of somehow being able to absorb and dominate the thing eventually, as irrational and recognizable as the urge to jump from a high place in order to surmount the fear. Just as El Doctoro was the first to use real historical characters in a fictional matrix, then a stream of others began to do the same. Aykroyd, Winterson, Rushdie, etc. Doctorow receives little credit for this and is not as well known as the others, yet he did it first. Ballard is in a similar position, a writer who invented a territory that was colonized swiftly and efficiently by many others. Happens all over. All day, the derelict walls and ceiling of the soundstage had reverberated with the endless din of traffic accelerating across the Midtown flyover, which arched 50 feet above the studio's roof, a frenzied hypermanic babble of jostling horns, shrilling tires, plunging brakes, and engines that hammered down the empty corridors and stairways to the soundstage on the second floor, making the leaden air feel leaden and angry. J.G. Ballard, The Sound Sweep, 1960. Architectural music. The music is made of layers of echoes and reverberations. The form of chant now known as early music was allowed by large-scale architecture, through harmonies which occur when a human voice responds to its own delayed reflections from the walls of churches and cathedrals. Through new reverberation technology, we can now sing into digital architecture of infinite dimensions. layers of music and image can interconnect seamlessly and in the same ways for the first time, since they have recently become part of the same digital continuum. John Foxx, About Cathedral Oceans, 2005. Now, I read that you pick up ideas for music by listening to ambiences. Do you respond to the ambient nature of Ballard's work, to the sonic/architectural elements in his writing? It seems to me that Ballard's work records the ambient hum of the technological landscape, which is then reflected in inner space. Yes, that is a lot in how we respond to cities, and how we use them to build ourselves, that we are just beginning to get to. I like the idea of architecture and the city as an extension of the human body. This springs also from McLuhan, but Ballard elaborated the idea and explored it in literature. I also like his ruminations on time and on memory. These are both subjects that preoccupy me more and more. I feel that cities and organizations of all kinds are built on this same unconscious matrix. We keep elaborating outwards on our own internal structures. Libraries are an extension of memory. Rooms can represent compartmented thoughts and feelings, even fears and moods. Television is an extension of the eye, radio of the ear, etc. I also feel that streets and avenues are neural pathways we reuse to reprogram ourselves with layers of memory and association. I think all this is amoebic in origin and have replicated it outward since then as an evolutionary survival and colonization mechanism. We're all still hard at it, building the old coral reef. Ballard has used many of these kinds of thought experiments beautifully as components of his writing, manifesting them in landscape and detail. An intimate knowledge of urban ambience is a joy as deep as anything in green nature. I have a fascination with grey nature, or technicolor nature. Ecologies are emerging which are as subtle as anything green. In cities you have to walk and experience and try not to allow your knowledge or present understanding prejudice your reception of the experience. Requires a trance-like state and concentration combined with suspension of disbelief. Watch out for traffic. He sank to his knees in the soft loam which covered the floor, and steadied himself against a barnacled lamp-post. In a relaxed, graceful moon-stride he loped slowly through the deep sludge. On his right were the dim flanks of the buildings lining the sidewalks, the silt piled in the soft dunes up to their first-floor windows. Most of the windows are choked with debris, fragments of furniture and metal cabinets, sections of floorboards matted together by the fucus and cephalopods. J.G. Ballard, The Drowned World, 1962. Down Oxford Street the buildings were festooned with ivy and Virginia creeper. Trees grew from the windows of Selfridges. The pavements and tarmac were split by plane trees spreading across Marble Arch from Hyde Park. Purple loosestrife waved in the breeze, scattering its white, floating seeds, glowing in the late afternoon light. Above him the sky was bright blue now, and the light was going golden across the top edges of the crumbling buildings. At the bottom of Oxford Street stood the tall Centrepoint Tower, its remaining upper windows glinting, while most of the base was covered in vines. Mile-a-minute vine especially had grown out from many of the gardens, and living up to its name had swamped quite a number of roads and buildings in the city. John Foxx, The Quiet Man, 1982. The car crash element in Metamatic is often used to identify Crash as Ballard's major influence on your career, but is JGB's The Drowned World another kind of text for you? Were your visions of a verdant London, and by extension Cathedral Oceans, inspired or at least informed by Ballard's imagining of a devolved Earth with its urban areas overgrown by jungle and swamps? This began long before I came across The Drowned World. I was relieved when I read it, because at first I feared it might have taken the territory I was developing, but I do think it had an effect of defining more closely what I was doing with Cathedral Oceans, if in a negative way. The visions of an overgrown London also began earlier, and there is some correspondence there. I'd seen a painting of an aerial view of woodland, which on closer scrutiny turned out to be a view of a ruined, overgrown London from the top of Centrepoint. I also remembered a Dormier engraving of a view of a deserted London being sketched by a future tourist. Such images are part of a long tradition of contemplation of ruins, being useful devices for meditations on the works of humankind. Shelley's poem Ozymandias, the end scene of the Statue of Liberty in Planet of the Apes, Quatermass in the Pit, and Celebrity Surgery being other useful ones that immediately spring to mind. Your MySpace bio says that when you gave up music and worked as a visual artist, you illustrated a Ballard book cover. What book was that, and can you tell me a little about the process by which you arrived at a suitable aesthetic? Sadly, I never made an image for a Ballard cover. I worked on new books by lots of authors I enjoyed: Anthony Burgess, Jeanette Winterson, Shakespeare, Doris Lessing, among many others. I would have been more than pleased to do something for Ballard, along with Burroughs, Ishiguro, Auster, Byatt, Dr. O, Pullman, Calvino. Ballards would certainly have been derived from video or Super 8mm, found, damaged footage. Books may move in future, so a flickering film loop is perfect. The images of surrealism are the iconography of inner space. Popularly regarded as a lurid manifestation of fantastic art concerned with states of dream and hallucination, surrealism is the first movement, in the words of Odilon Redon, to place the logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. This calculated submission to the impulses and fantasies of our inner lives, to the rigors of time and space, produces a heightened or alternate reality beyond that familiar to our sight or senses. To move through these landscapes is a journey of return to one's innermost being. J.G. Ballard, The Coming of the Unconscious, 1966. Your work seems to have the logic of dreams, of surrealist art, where externally illogical worlds function perfectly well according to their own internal logic. Bredilon's logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. I've always thought dreams are important, and a number of coincidences and waking experiences involving dreams, and memories of dreams as a component, continue to bear this out. There's a neat intersection here with cinema. I think cinema can be a sort of public dreaming, the same time shifts, flashbacks, and so on. It seems that the language of cinema is being drawn almost entirely from dreams, and we are witnessing an externalization, an extension of this process, through technology. Of course, cinema is a compound, made of ingredients from theatre and literature as well, and those bear separate attention. Songs are an interesting compound of music and words as chant, a hypnotic process where the operator attempts to slip a piece of dream cinema under the door while the recipient is distracted, an attempt to persuade the listener to suspend disbelief long enough to watch the movie. But it's an internal movie, one composed of the listener's own experience. All you do is allow a space big enough for the listener to walk inside and construct their own movie while believing it is all someone else's work. This strange and poetic film is a fusion of science fiction, psychological fable, and photo montage, and creates a series of potent images of the inner landscapes of time. This succession of disconnected images is a perfect means for projecting the quantified memories and movements through time but at a film's subject matter. J.G. Ballard on La Jetée, 1966. That film came out in 1962. Your lyrics freeze moments in time, while also suggesting a kind of neurological time travel, maybe in the same way that memories work, or photographs. We know that Last Year in Marienbad is one of your favourite films, but is Chris Marker's La Jetée another influence? Yes, I really enjoy La Jetée, one of the first flashback movies. After this it gradually became part of the language, but it's taken around 40 years to get fully assimilated. An incredible and singular act of originality on Chris Marker's part, since film is such a fast-moving medium. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is the latest version. It's taken that long for everyone else to catch up. You can only find this place by drifting. It is impossible to walk directly here. You must first surrender yourself to the tides of the city. It takes years to do it. Slowly the tides will take you here. John Foxx in The Grey Suit, 1997. Do you see your philosophy and ideas as embodying a psychogeographical aspect, echoing Guy Debord? I'm especially thinking of your notions of drift music and drifting through the city. Yes, I was Debording before I came across his ideas. Everyone does it to some extent, it's just that their attention is on other things, allowing the really important aspects to slip by. What's in this slipstream deeply interests me. Pettit remains the most Ballardian of British film essayists. There's an element of shared background, colonial childhood, public school, suburbs, but it goes deeper than that. The fascination with the frozen aesthetic of motorways, business parks, airport hotels, franchised surrealism, a present tense world of swift, spare sentences, a controlled surface disguising a sense of loss, a damaged past that can only be annealed through the rearrangement of images. Ian Sinclair, Crash, 1999. It seems a similar approach to the London Orbital bookend film by Ian Sinclair and Chris Petit. What do you think of their project, which of course is refracted through Ballard, to reclaim London as a narrative space for drifting? It's about time. London was neglected as a myth land before Ballard. I used to wonder why, when it was so gloriously filthy and sprawling and magical and repetitious and various and shifting, richer than Los Angeles or New York, bleaker than Beijing, more concealed than a convent, driftland in Excelsis, or at least in Albion. First Ballard, then Aykroyd came along from a completely different angle. Now Sinclair is on the case. It's good to see this happening. Chris Petit's film was a brave early attempt to weave all these elements together and stands as a sort of historico-fictional documentary fragment. It blueprints a lot of British film possibilities that haven't been taken up yet. I was excited by this at the time because it looked like the beginning of a sort of new British cinema, verite which has been hinted at, but hasn't quite happened. Kes is another example, in a different genre. An interesting evolution through three directors. He began life as Antoine Donnell in Truffaut's 400 Blows and ended up filleted as Billy Elliot in a ballet frock. How We Kill Our Finest. We always need these accounts so we know who we are and where we live, as directly opposed to the generic ready-mades available through most media. These mostly have sinister subtexts anyway, and so are best ignored. I remember not watching TV for 2 years and discovering I lived in a different country. Get out there and walk. What do you think Ballard's greatest contribution to late 20th century / early 21st century art has been? Making new images of where we currently live, positing terrifying new aesthetics, then evolving it all to a fully realized state. Each afternoon in the deserted cinema, Tallis was increasingly distressed by the images of colliding motor cars, celebrations of his wife's death. The slow-motion newsreels recapitulated all his memories of childhood, the realization of dreams which, even during the safe immobility of sleep, would develop into nightmares of anxiety. J.G. Ballard, The Atrocity Exhibition, 1970. The old newscasts affected him greatly. The Kennedy assassination, the images of Christine Keeler, early Beatles footage, all in a slightly worn black and white. He edited together a film containing all these images and more, and played it constantly. He found it profoundly moving, the images gaining even more emotive power with each viewing. All these characters of his past moving in old daylight, waving and smiling and moving on. John Foxx, The Quiet Man, 1982. The Atrocity Exhibition reads like an instruction manual on how to disrupt mass media and recontextualize technology, a manual you would appear to have digested, judging from the above quote. Now what strikes me most about your liner notes to Tiny Colour movies is the sense they give of a continuous history of people working in the margins to break down this notion of filmmaking as a monolithic, mysterious, endless process. It really did put me in mind of the T figure in Atrocity, reconfiguring the media landscape in a way that makes sense, as did your Quiet Man story. Is there a line we can draw that connects the Atrocity Exhibition to The Quiet Man, to Arnold Weich's Bryant, to Tiny Colour movies? Sure, we can easily draw several dozen lines in and out. Some ideas are cumulative. Will Arnold's collection ever be made available for public screenings? There are plans. Clearly the time is right for a proper real-world revolution in filmmaking. We have the tools and the new technology, and, as Arnold's collection demonstrates, the president. Movies will be played with just as sound was sampled, for fun and surrealism, simply because it can be done. I remember positing this 5 years ago in a talk at the London College of Music and Media. Around that time I made a movie called A Man Made of Shadows from several other movies. This made a new movie from existing films by collaging, repurposing, homaging, stealing, sampling, appropriating, whatever you like to call it. Repurposing is my current fave term, along with theft. Watch out, Hollywood. Movies had better get used to this because it will happen. Inevitable. A financial legal structure already exists to deal with ownership and payment from sampling in music, but this hasn't been investigated yet because lawyers and laws don't cross-pollinate easily, but it will happen. Everyone can now make films, and this wasn't possible until 3 years ago. But like music, film is a swarm activity. Solo filmmakers and commercial cinema will increasingly arrive at Tarnation-type scenarios, and I expect some obsessive genius to make solo high-grade commercial animations in the near future. Entirely new forms will evolve. Documentary is in for a huge revival. We will get to know how everything works from the inside. There will be a great deal of government, counter-information and myth-planting. Virals, flash movies, phones, e-paper and e-books will generate new and hybrid purposes, some unguessable, some too sordid to contemplate, and others a sheer delight. Old media will get cannibalized all along the way. There will soon be a swift download, the Napster equivalent for movies. Pornography will become a mainstream Hollywood genre. Everyone will film everyone else doing everything. Virals will be endemic, and there will be much inverted subversive hijacking of these new forms by crafty commerce. There will always be a grubby subcurrent. We've already had snuff movies and happy slapping. God help us. Some of it will get worse as surveillance increases in efficiency. What's the next step then? New folktales will evolve. For example, from people filming infidelity with other people's wives then emailing it to them. Awareness of this will force modifications in behaviour and new etiquettes. Office parties will become more guarded from now on. Mobile phone cameras are the next device for urban dramas of all kinds. I was fortunate to be able to view some of the Week's Bryant collection recently. They were like flickering transmissions from another world. Here you see old sunlight from other times and other lives. Juxtapositions of underwater automobiles, the highways of Los Angeles, movies made from smoke and light, discarded surveillance footage from 1964 New York hotel rooms. After the viewing, I began to understand what Arnold meant when he spoke so passionately about the intrinsic beauty of the medium, how the scratches, the grain, the bleached-out sections, all once regarded as imperfections, can now be appreciated as qualities, elements which only add to the mystery, the emotional and intellectual resonance, and the sensual appreciation of film. John Foxx, liner notes, Tiny Color Movies, 2006. Foxx continues here, we'll also need to develop new aesthetics of film, to regard elements formerly regarded as faults as intrinsic qualities inherent in film itself. The beauty of scratches, bleached out film ends, emulsion faults, grain, frame slip, etc., just as we now value surface scratches in audio sampling. Scale will also be a vital component. New projection technologies are emerging. I want to see a 24-hour showing of a single close-up from a selected Hollywood movie. Let's bathe in it. Projected 500 feet high, onto smoke, onto clouds, into oceans and lakes. Project vast slow-motion home movies so we can dissolve into a glorious buzz of glowing grain. Let's have a sunset at each end of the sky, all night. Project people as buildings and buildings as skies. The possibilities of projection and digitization are multiplying as we speak. LCD shirts showing slow-mo pornography, naked glow clothing, invisibility suits which display the background at any viewing angle, picked up by woven nanocams, Steadicam projectable faces, change your face every 2 hours. It will drive us all crazy when spam vision rogue projection advertisers get started. So will simplicity be the crucial thing, systemically of course. Only if you have to operate a damn computer. Or will the angle between two walls have a happy ending? Now you're kidding me. Fine thought for Foxx to end on. Afterward, a thought occurred to me within hours of posting this interview. Are the found movies of Arnold Weik's Bryant fictitious? Something had been nagging at me about the aphorisms attributed to Arnold in the Tiny Color Movies liner notes. They sound exactly like John Foxx. Also, Arnold's nowhere to be found on Google, which is no indication of anything really, but all the same I can't help wondering, do the filmmakers in Arnold's collection, indeed does Arnold himself, even exist? The liner notes are brilliantly evocative, full of urban explorations such as the burnt footprints on sidewalks that Frank Watts is supposed to have captured on video. Foxx writes, on his habitual walks through London, Watts gradually came to notice something strange. He often came across odd, burnt patches on pathways and more secluded pavements. These were always small and often contained the charred remains of items of clothing or shoes. Watts conjectures that these places appeared as a result of a person at such a location being subject to some intense discharge of energy such as a lightning strike or possibly an unknown method of transportation or vaporization. Urban drift, walking through the city, submitting to psychic entry points, Surely this is yet another brilliantly evocative John Foxx short story. Yes, the more I think about it, the more I think that's the case. Rereading the liner notes, the parallels of these filmmakers, of their obsessions and aesthetics, to Foxx himself now seem all too obvious. Let's not forget that John Foxx is a character that Dennis Lee himself has said he inhabits because John Foxx is smarter than me. Arnold's filmmakers are called Robert Rounsfield, Jerry Colden, Ernest Lubin. Like John Foxx, these are humdrum yet fanciful names, mythical yet ordinary, dull names to the point of incandescence. Their bios and summaries exhibit all the traits of the condensed novels in the Atrocity exhibition. One of them's even called Alan Marker, surely a nod and a wink to Chris Marker, but infused with a suburban English first name. The section on Alan Marker even reads like a précis of Chris Marker's career, with particular reference to La Jetée, which of course we discussed in the interview. Foxx writes, "For the past 4 years, Alan Marker has made a fascinating series of short films. The images are carefully framed and sequenced, moving film clips and loops, as well as photographic stills. The result is a strange merging of the subject with the projections. A sort of modern, mediumistic transference appears to take place. The faces seem to melt and reform into each other as the initial subject dissolves into a series of hybrid identities, nebulae of remembered and incorporated personalities. These films are surely unique in the history of filmmaking." It all seems so obvious now. I'll go so far as to say that I've been had, but I can't say I wasn't warned. Rereading the interview, I can see now that John was scattering clues throughout, dropping hints which I blatantly failed to tune into. The marker exchange, the Ballard book cover that never was, with its found damaged Super 8 aesthetic, his admiration of the beauty of scratches and bleached out film ends, identical to the elements that have so engaged Arnold, and which I quoted, his belief in cinema as public dreaming, his cryptic answer to my atrocity/TCM comparison. I feel like I've been the unsuspecting guinea pig in a very clever thought experiment conducted by Dr. Foxx. These people do not exist. When I asked John if Arnold would make his collection available to the public, he said there are plans. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, and a real person named Arnold Wakes Bryant, with his precious cargo of found films, will one day emerge from the shadows, but maybe more likely it will be John himself who will step into the spotlight with a collection of moving pictures that represent the first tangible fruits of his own oft-stated ambition to make sample films. Of course, it doesn't matter either way, fictitious or not, the results will be incredible and inspiring and Ballardian to the max. From K-Punk, Mark Fisher, published September 24th, 2003. Reality is elsewhere. The periphery is where the future reveals itself. J.G. Ballard. I also think Wire and the Banshees count as London, since Watford and Bromley are in London's orbit. Part of embracing the future is always rejecting the past. In fact, this applies to people who move from the provinces to the centre as well. I was a bit surprised to see Luca argue that people from the provinces always want to defend the provinces. Surely it can work the other way around as well. You can be over-eager to shake the small-town dust off your feet. Ballard is one of the few poets of the suburbs. The more typical stance is to dismiss them as non-zones, resting places, the phrase dormitory town capturing this perfectly, whose airy mediocre pleasantness equates with an incurable existential dullness, a fundamental inauthenticity. That, in fact, would have very much captured my own discomfort about suburbia when I was growing up in it. It never felt real. To us dreaming suburbanites, the only real place in the country, paradoxically because of its hypermediatization, was London, this giving a slightly different spin on Luca's claim that London is the only real city in England. And America is even more real. We who lived in the suburbs of towns that were themselves anonymous and mediocre were exiles from the city's real, insubstantial wraiths, resigned to our status as non-beings. The city is not the only real. The rural, with its mighty, deep past indifference to the ephemeral, its enduring time, in which things go on the same, though generations pass, hardy, has its own claim to fundamental reality. As with the city, it is the rural's aestheticization, its capacity for translation into art, that gives the countryside its impression of the real. The suburb is neither nor, the buffer zones between these two reals. When 2 years ago, in flight from London logjam, in photosynthetic hunger for greenery, in a curve back towards my childhood, I moved to Bromley, I was self-consciously fleeing the real. Yet, upon my sort of return, the suburban struck me as less unreal than, as Ballard has tirelessly insisted, surreal. Streets that seem like collages brought to life, full of strange incongruities that could only seem natural in the sedentary stillness of the suburb. Apartment complexes that resemble seaside villas, looking out on a busy thoroughfare rather than the ocean, as if they've been dumped there by one of those cosmic collectors from Doctor Who that would wrench life forms out of context and reassemble them as carnival exhibits. Lawns so precisely manicured that Lewis Carroll's Queen of Hearts could play croquet upon them. It's also eccentric. Tempting to lapse into a Lynchian depth psychoanalysis here, a weakness to which Ballard himself is often prone, to shift from the ironic soft-focus idyll of the long shot into the unforgiving grisly detail of the close-up to look for the id beneath the suburban superego. More interesting to recognise that the surface is already psychotic, that nothing lies beneath. For Ballard, our assumption that cities are the future is an overhang from 19th century modernism, a notion as quaintly endearingly outmoded as the prophecies of Jules Verne. With its concentrational density, its cramped streets, its unplanned sprawl, London is a horse-drawn Victorian relic. To Ballard's delight, and to Ian Sinclair's horror, the future is not the city but the suburb. Unlike the old population centres, whether the ancient Roman shells or the relatively recent residual slag heaps of industrialism, the suburbs have been built with the car in mind. They thus give rise to the developments with which Sinclair abhors, but cannot help be fascinated by. Ghostless out-of-town retail parks and shopping complexes, non-places accessible only by car, zones whose calculated, franchised anti-locality makes them resemble nothing so much as airports. Cities recede like 19C smog in the strip-lit, purpose-built hygiene of Bluewater, Kent. Now finally, I'll read out this, from no Oakshot, a review of Stonewalling by Huang Ji and Ryuji Otsuka. This was published on September 12, 2022. Huang Ji is among the last handful of Chinese directors to sneak through the portal distribution company Degenerate Films, the company of an important 2000s artistic nexus in Chinese cinema, also including Rotterdam and Locarno film festivals, that was able to facilitate an entry point for alternative and outsider Chinese filmmakers to enter the international art house mainstream before that pathway was essentially closed on the American end. Along with partner in filmmaking and life, cinematographer/director Otsuka Ryuji, she has become established as one of the core figures of a new wave in Chinese art film on the festival circuit. The duo's latest film, Stonewalling, depicts Lin, a 20-year-old Hunanese woman dispassionately fumbling through a year of her life as she carries an unplanned pregnancy to term. She is largely isolated, perpetually scrolling on her phone and non-committal to her supposed life goals of learning English and becoming a flight attendant. Meanwhile, her mother, who runs a women's clinic and is being exploited by a multi-level marketing scam on the side, has caused complications in a client's pregnancy. The client's more influential family, the father runs a small chain of kindergartens, is now hounding her for crippling compensation payments. After an abandoned attempt to make quick money by ovum donation, Lynn connects the dots and decides to give her baby to the other family in exchange for her mother's debt being dropped. Lynn is quietly non-participatory in a very Gen Z way. It's evocative of the lying flat meme that dominated Chinese social media last year, but also of general social trends that have been replicated among today's youth the world over. They are more isolated, less romantically engaged, but also less inclined toward crime and addiction. In short, they are defined by their passivity. They are also echoes of the compounding crises of fertility that have been plaguing China in recent years, as well as the filmmaker's established preoccupation with female sexuality and reproductive health. At a more fundamental level, this film and the works that directly surround it represent a plateauing of the trajectory of Chinese art cinema. While films like Dwelling in the Fujian Mountains and Mama legitimately succeed and contribute to the time-honored lineage of Chinese visual artistry, it's tempting to imagine what could have been in their place. The avant-gardism of 2000s digital has been sublimated by analog thinking and high definitions of hyperreal HD, and while this hasn't been unique to China, indeed it has more or less been the story of the last 20 years of global cinema, it's particularly disheartening given that China has had one of the largest and most radical digital art scenes in the world. The Spartan digital experiments of Huang's peers and forebears in the Degenerate scene delving into counterculture and counter-reality, has been stabilized and moderated into a meticulous slow cinema process, here manifested in a formal approach of long takes, mid-distance shots, no camera movement, and little non-diegetic sound. This asphetic mode isn't text-independent though, as here the glacial editing schema and static, naturalistic eyeline-framed compositions firmly parallel the slow drift of our protagonist as she observes the passage of her own life largely with ambivalence and detachment. The filmmaker's comments that stonewalling is observing a post-TikTok China also seem to bear its filmic locus. The formalism is in diametric opposition to the accelerated visual language and frenetic rhythms of the video platform. It recalls Peter Watkin's critique about the monoform, that the growing speed of editing rhythms and heightened visual sensationalism of late 90s/early thousands spectacle cinema was part of a new hegemonic language of media, a spectre that has haunted the world of art cinema ever since that deeply insightful misdiagnosis was levied upon us. The Changsha setting, an archetypal Middle China city, is documented with admirable precision. Famous landmarks like the enormous stone sculpture of Chairman Mao, which appears fleetingly, aside, Huang and Otsuka show off the spaces that are endemic to daily life in Changsha, capturing the Hunan capital in perhaps the most authentic terms of any internationally distributed feature. We even get to hear the Changsha dialect, a variant of Xiang Chinese, featuring heavy commonality with Mandarin, which is very rarely heard in feature films, even though set in this city. If you have spent much time in a city like Changsha, among the normal people that populate it, you will likely have heard dozens of stories much like the one told in Stonewalling, and met dozens of characters like those who appear in it. Babies traded transactionally, the forging of birth certificates, debt, financial hardship, gambling addiction, the dissolution of family bonds, and other intersecting crises of modernity are all part of the social tapestry. Much of this arises out of recent history. Over the past generation, massive numbers of people have gone from living in post-communist rural, communitarian villages in which everyone is a near neighbor to atomized city living, all endless rows of indistinct apartment complexes in urban centers like Changsha, which has a comparable population to New York City. Indeed, the mother's dialect here is subtly different to that of urban Changsha, likely indicating her origin in such a village. But then, such small cities that consumed the rural sprawl were almost instantly fled for further upgrades. Guangzhou, London, Australia. The dangling promise of a better life in the latter two is constantly alluded to in Stonewalling, and this is no surprise really. If one accepts the logic that such a small, negligible GDP rural communities should be abandoned for the financial opportunity of cities, surely one should abandon a city of middling opportunity like Changsha for a gigalopolis like Guangzhou or the wealth of the world's richest countries. The general thrust of this notion heavily parallels the urban strain of the fifth generation of Chinese film, far less known internationally than the folk cinema of Zhang Yimou and Chen Kaige, but more impactful domestically, and most notably typified by director-screenwriter Xie Gang and novelist-director Wang Shuo. Their film centered the same concerns: the loss of identity, tradition, and intimacy in cities, and the growing diaspora seeking wealth and opportunity overseas, all driven by a languid pessimism similar to what Huang and Otsuka have engendered here. But where Wang and Xie were irreverent to the point of antisociality, here their misogyny is inverted for feminism. While this parallel is due to the social presence of Xie and others, it's likely also a function of the recent fifth generation's resurgence in popularity, itself largely a function of the inward shift of Chinese cultural apparatuses and the identification of the 1980s as a semi-Arcadian moment in modern China from which patriotism can be drawn. In this sense, Stonewalling is on the other side of the Hi Mum or Leap coin, while many of the actual artists behind the original wave 40 years ago have been pushing ahead in new directions. See recent directorial work from Jia Fei and Huo Jianqi. But for the most part, all of this is only representative of a broader cultural critique, insofar as the corner of reality Stonewalling reflects is a mundane microcosm of a broader whole. The film's observances are dissolute and unpointed. Stonewalling could never attract an audience in Changsha itself, not because of censorship, or because its social realism cuts too close to home, but precisely because it doesn't cut. It only copies. Ultimately, very few will be satisfied by the depictional mode of operation here, Imagine your own life in its most menial and ugly moments, when you are lacking motivation, unthinkingly making life decisions, dealing with family problems, embarrassing your boyfriend at a party and going home to sit on the toilet alone while your body aches, all unromantically transposed into a series of long takes with the emotional distance of CCTV footage. That is essentially what stonewalling amounts to, a small corner of reality unflinchingly captured on the screen with earnest literalism and aestheticized within the cracks of a structure of absolute representation. Each filmmaker in this global current is contributing their own small piece to a grand cartographic tapestry for screen tourists, like the proverbial map, so large and detailed it replaces the land on which it is based. Like Rust of Fire, the epi-artistic process at work here may ultimately be more corrosive to reality than the social media world that Huang and Otsuka so deliberately frame it in opposition to, but the film's strengths remain notable, if not a wholesale salvation, for its aesthetic deficiencies.